Paris never ran out of the living. It ran out of room for the dead. So the city did something almost no capital dared. It carried its ancestors underground and arranged them with a mason's patience, wall after wall, street after street, until a second Paris took shape in the dark. The Paris Catacombs, the city beneath the city. They'll tell you it began with space. That's true, but it wasn't just a storage problem. Cemeteries in the old quarters had been filling for centuries. Rain lifted coffins, walls bulged. Markets, ovens, and schools stood next to churchyards whose soil remembered every plague in winter. The Innocents' graveyard, oldest of them all, had pits so deep that each generation lowered its dead onto the soft history of the last. And when the wind was wrong, Paris learned what memory smells like. The solution was older than the crisis. Long before the boulevards were drawn, the city tunneled for stone, creamy limestone that built bridges, churches, mansions, and facades that still throw neat shadows at noon. The quarries were cut in levels and galleries, held up by pillars and chalk-white ribs. When a project finished, the underground didn't. The emptied galleries lingered below streets that would one day be crowded with carts, then carriages, then buses and scooters. A city is heavy. It presses on what it forgets. By the 18th century, the forgetfulness failed. A cellar caved here, a lane slumped there, and the people who kept the city standing, engineers and surveyors with ink on their cuffs, were sent below to measure the danger. They walked with candles. They chalked marks on pillars. They made a map of the hollow places and realized Paris sat on the remains of its own appetite for stone. At the same time, the ground threatened the living. The dead threatened the living's water and air. Orders were written. Prayers were said. And then, very practically, wagons rolled at night. Bones were gathered by the thousands, not with hysteria, but with routine. In the lanes near the cemetery gates, people learned the sound of wheels under a dark cloth, a steady rattle that meant a city was trying to keep its balance. They brought the bones to a former quarry shaft at the edge of the southern faubourgs and lowered them into the old stoneworks, down to a level where the noise of hooves softened to a rumor. At first, it was a transfer, nothing more. Stacks and heaps, long piles of femurs with skulls set aside. But soon the caretakers did what caretakers do. They arranged, they cleaned. They made order from the crowd. A wall of tibias became a wall, not a heap. Skulls were set like punctuation in a sentence a city had been writing since the Middle Ages. There is an inscription that greets you if you could read in the dark. Stop. This is the Empire of the Dead. It sounds like theater, but it reads like policy. The empire has rules. The bones must be stacked in courses. The galleries must be shored with masonry where the quarrymen left the stone too thin. The pillars must be banded and named so that a collapse doesn't take a house with it. It is an ossuary and an engineering project at the same time, a place to honor the past while keeping the present upright. Not all of it is solemn. Some of it is careful and unintentionally beautiful, alternating ribs of long bones and ovals of skulls, like a stonemason's pattern book rewritten in anatomy. Between the walls are spaces where the unarranged bones lie in discrete mounds, covered to keep them from slipping. Behind the facades is the truth of numbers. The caretakers set markers with the origins: Saint Laurent, Saint Nicolas, Saint Eustache, and plaques noting the years when each cemetery was emptied. The living like a label. The dead give us time. Think of the decisions made by lamplight. How many skulls to a row? Whether to leave a niche open for a future transfer. How to build a fountain in the cool rock where water drips forever. A quarryman's comfort the bones inherit. Above ground, revolutions were argued in cafes. Below, a quieter revolution was practiced. One of logistics, patience, and a kind of civic tenderness that has no poetry until you're standing in it. They say the first time you truly understand the place is the first time your candle or your phone screen if you forget yourself, meets the gaze of a skull in the wall and you realize you've been watched by someone who never learned your city's later names. In the arranged light, the eye sockets are as blank as sealed doors. And yet the mind supplies an address, a street, a bakery, a child who whistled. The catacombs teach you to imagine backward. The galleries bend and turn. Sometimes the ceiling lowers and you feel the weight of Paris as a physical thing, not a metaphor. Sometimes the space opens into a chamber where pillars have been squared and banded with neat belts of stone, and you can see the surveyor's marks that tied the underground to the map above. A pillar might be painted with a street name, an act of translation between the dark grid and the one we use every day. It makes you think of an atlas where the living and the dead share a coordinate system. There are stories that live here, as stories do wherever people move slowly and listen. One tells of a man from the Val de Grace who went below on an errand, took a turn too far, and met the perfect indifference of distance. Years later, they found his remains near a wall and carried him out with a respect earned by time and mistake. Whether you believe the names changes nothing. The moral is older than the city. Underground, certainty is borrowed. The caretaker whose hand appears most often in this order was an inspector with a patient mind. He understood that you can persuade the living to accept the dead if you make the place legible. Walls were faced, plaques were carved, quotations were set in stone, snatches of moral verse and lines to remind the hurried that every errand ends in the same quiet room. The city learned to visit. It learned to speak softly, to count without saying the number aloud. There is a kind of hush that belongs only to places where breath is noticed. Underground, every footstep measures the gallery. Every whisper has edges. A drop of water can teach you tempo. It is not a place for drama, yet it contains an undeclared theater. The way a skull leans slightly where the wall has settled. The way a row of femurs becomes a line that carries your eye into the turn. The way a name on a plaque can pull a forgotten parish back into the map. Above, centuries churned. Kingdoms failed, flags changed, the river kept its curve. Below, the bone walls endured drafts, repairs, and the slow patience of stone. The city widened. New buildings pressed their weight into the limestone, and the limestone, stiff with its cargo, held. A cathedral doesn't stand only because of what is seen. It stands because of everything you don't see. Shafts, pillars, galleries, and decisions that meant someone could sleep without worrying. The floor would fall into the past. There are chambers where the quarrymen left carvings, little reliefs of places they admired, or small models of walls and bastions chiseled during pauses in the work. They are not grand. They are careful, the way tired hands are careful late in a shift. To pass them is to feel the human scale of an enterprise that, on a map, looks abstract. People cut this city into parts and then trusted those parts to hold them up. Sometimes people went below for reasons that had nothing to do with policy. Soldiers, lovers, smugglers, wanderers who disliked straight lines. There were decades when the underground felt like a rumor that only certain ears could hear, and decades when it was supervised with a firm hand. Doors were bricked. Doors were reopened. The empire of the dead tolerates visitors, but it prefers respect to attention. Pause and consider the arithmetic. In the walls are centuries of epidemics, winters, harvest accidents, and private griefs that left no line in a history book. In the plaques are years pulled like thread through the fabric. This cemetery in 1786, that one in 1804, another in the long tail of transfers that continued as the city cleaned and recleaned its conscience. If you think of the catacombs as a museum, you miss the point. It is a ledger. It balances the accounts of space and memory. There is also humor here, dry and unintended. A notice might ask you not to touch what can no longer feel. A barrier might keep you from stepping where 1,000 feet have already worn the stone smooth. The contradictions are gentle, a place that honors silence with signs, a darkness managed by maintenance schedules. A skull that has become part of a wall and, by becoming architecture, is remembered longer than anyone who once spoke to it by name. If you listen for Paris, you can hear it even here. Not the traffic, something smaller. A faint tremor from the world above when a metro glides past. The echo of a heel on a stair 3 chambers away. The predictable tick of a drip near a junction where there's always been a leak. The underground has weather. It is cool in the kind of way that teaches you what 14 degrees feels like without a thermometer. It smells like dust and stone, and a neutrality that refuses to be called sweet or sour. Some corridors are marked with dates and initials from the inspectors who checked them and left proof. This pillar reinforced, that arch banded, this gallery walled off after a slump. It's a maintenance log written in masonry. The handwriting of the city is careful and slow. Anyone can build a story. Few people are patient enough to keep it standing. And yes, because a city is also mischief, there have always been those who wanted to go farther than the polite route allows. They learned the turns, kept their own maps, and made their own traditions. The catacombs have seen picnics and pranks, and the occasional theater that performed once to an audience of friends who would never admit the route they took home. The city tolerated this in some years and chased it in others. The underground remembers both the laughter and the boots. There are bones and arrangements that have acquired names. A barrel built of tibias and skulls like a column. A long wall that looks like a tide, held back by intention alone. A niche where a plaque quotes the old sentence, "Remember you must die," and for once it doesn't feel like scolding. It feels like permission to live and to carry your part without drama. If you could follow one skull out of the wall into its former address, what would you find? A glove mended by candlelight? A song heard from across a courtyard? A taste of pears in a season when pears were expensive? You cannot follow, and that is the point. The catacombs do this for you. They let the city keep its upper rooms for work and light, while the lower rooms keep the weight of what all that work and light cost. In doing so, the underground is not morbid. It is generous. Think, too, about the craftsman whose skill made the order possible. The man who could stack a wall so that it would not creep. The woman who, by habit, wrapped the loose long bones in canvas to keep them from rolling while work moved along the gallery. The inspector who had the nerve to call a section unsafe and to halt the transfer until a brace was raised. A city is not only kings and architects, it is decisions made at the tempo of footsteps. The distance between a bakery and a bone wall is shorter than it seems. In a morning market, a boy weighed flour on a scale polished by the hands of time. That afternoon, a man set 3 skulls level because a row was losing its line. The work above and the work below share a vocabulary: weight, balance, patience, repair. The catacombs make the kinship obvious. There is a place where the ceiling lowers just enough that your shoulders draw in. In that slight compression is an education. How quickly the body becomes aware of stone. How much of your attention is claimed by the idea of earth carried on your back. Then the ceiling rises, and you are grateful to breath's small luxury. The lesson lingers. We live under conditions we rarely see, and we are steadied by work that rarely asks to be thanked. When you step near a junction, the sound changes. The air moves differently. A steady drip becomes a metronome for your thoughts. It's here, at a simple T in the stone, that you realize how the underground organizes the mind as much as the city organizes the streets. You have a sense of where you came from, not because you can see it, but because the path has given you a memory in turns. If there is a single image that holds the place together, it's the idea of a wall that is both a memorial and a brace. The bones do double duty. They honor the lives they contain, and they steady the ground for the lives above them. It's not an allegory, it's a fact. The empire of the dead is a part of the building code. We tend to think of the past as soft and the present as hard. Underground, The opposite is sometimes true. The present is fragile, plaster and habit. The past is stone and order. You can feel the kindness of that reversal when your footsteps match the rhythm of those who arrange the galleries to carry you safely through. Later centuries added their own layers of caution. Inspections, reinforcements, seasonal closures, and the occasional ceremony when another transfer finished. The names on the plaques became a way of reading Paris by its losses. Not a list of wars and kings, but of parishes and years. The underground refuses grandeur. It gives you accounting instead. People argue about numbers. How many? Which years saw the most carts? The place itself shrugs. It knows the total the way a tree knows its rings, without counting. What matters is that the living found a way to keep faith with the living by treating the dead as citizens whose last address deserved neatness. There are moments down here that feel like a conversation without words. A skull slightly chipped where a worker's tool slipped a century ago. A pillar with the faintest curve from settling, corrected long ago with a belt of stone and a line in a ledger. A tiny carved heart someone left near the end of a shift, no bigger than a thumbnail, already dusty the next day. The catacombs are full of such small courtesies, too humble for a guidebook and too human to ignore. Up above, you might cross a square named for a writer or a general. Down here, names are different. There is Rue de la Santé, traced in paint on a pillar to anchor a map in the mind. There is the memory of a churchyard that is now a market or a park. The underground keeps both maps honest, the official one and the one your feet carry. If you've ever felt that a city moves too fast to mean anything, the catacombs are the sermon you need. They slow the tempo to the speed of breath. They insist on the dignity of maintenance. They remind you that most of the heroic work in a metropolis is neither glorious nor visible. It is the setting of a course, the checking of a seam, the replacing of a rotten beam, the decision to tighten a row because time loosens everything it can reach. And when people speak of the place with fear, it is usually daylight fear. Fear of the unknown, of the dark, of being where maps simplify. The underground is not hungry, it is honest. It answers the questions you bring to it with the quietest possible reply. This is what remains, arranged so that the city can continue. The most generous insight the catacombs offer is not about death, but about belonging. Everyone here belonged once, to a street, a baker, a courtyard, a friend who laughed too loudly, a window that stuck in winter, a song caught from a doorway. The walls put all those belongings together without sorting by rank or fashion. It is a civics lesson taught in bone, that a city is made of equals in the end. Imagine for a second that you could rise straight up through all the levels, through stone, pipes, foundations, cellars, apartments, and attics, and see Paris as a stack of rooms that have borrowed strength from one another. The catacombs would be a long, cool shelf near the bottom, neat as a ledger and patient as a library. You would understand then why the city has a particular calm even in noise. It knows what is holding it up. When someone in the 19th century finished facing a new section of wall and stepped back to judge the line, they were doing what anyone who builds does, listening for the click of something set right. That click is down here in miles of galleries. It's in the evenness of courses, in the way a corner turns without slumping, in the yet-to-crack calm of a lintel that has handled 100 winters. Nothing down here asks for your opinion. It asks only for your pace to match its patience. If you can walk at that speed, the place gives you a gift. The sense that your own day, impatient and crowded, belongs to a longer, steadier story that forgives hurry by absorbing it. And when you leave, when the stairs tilt up and the air warms and the sound of wheels folds back into your hearing, you carry something ordinary and new. Not a thrill, not a fright. A respect for the work that holds the world together when no one is watching, and for the people whose last address is a wall that keeps the rest of us from sinking. The empire of the dead is not a threat. It is a promise kept.